Hello again, and welcome to another edition of Media Watch. I'm your co-host, Eric Tait.
I'm Bob Anthony.
And I'm Raymond Peterson.
And I'm their guest and friend, Alan Singer from Hofstra University.
And Dr. Singer is with us again because we're going to try to do some more perspectives on the issues we tackle. But before we get to those issues, this is being brought to you by the good graces of EVT Educational Productions, Manhattan Neighborhood Network, and we're on Zoom as usual for the time being. A good colleague of ours passed on April 2nd, April 4th. Bob, you'll tell us for real. But Bill McCreary was a veteran broadcast journalist, and Bob is going to give us a little quick tribute to who Bill was and what he did for broadcasting in New York, especially for Black journalists.
I mean, anybody who was watching TV in New York City in the era that he was on TV knew his face, knew the shows that he was on, knew the communities that he represented, and were familiar with his measured, learned, I guess you can call it, pace of delivering the news, and not just the news that the other local outlets had covered already, but the news important to the Black community, to the communities of color. And he passed back on April 4th. Somehow it took a while for the news to get out. I had heard it, as you did, Eric, on Facebook and elsewhere. But yeah, we just wanted to pay tribute to a great local journalist. And I'll just read the lead from the New York Times obituary, if that's okay, Eric.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Bill McCreary, an Emmy Award-winning reporter who was one of the first Black television journalists in New York and whose perspective helped fill a noticeable gap in local public affairs, died on April 4th in Brooklyn. He was 87. The cause was a neurological disease he had for many years, said O'Kellen McCreary, his wife of 62 years and his only immediate survivor. Now, I'll just read the next graph since it summarizes some of the work he did.
Great.
His death, which had not been made public earlier by his family, was announced this week by WNYW, the flagship of the Fox television network. He was hired in 1967 when the station Channel 5 was owned by Metro Media, known as WNEW, and he remained familiar on-air presence until he retired in 2000. A fantastic reporter who supported the New York Association of Black Journalists. He was at a number of his dinners and was just an epic part of New York journalism. Bill McCreary.
Great pioneer and pioneered a number of shows dealing with issues pertaining to the Black community, like the McCreary Report. And I think Black News may have been the other public affairs show. I'd have to double check that.
But the McCreary Report is what we all remember, since obviously it bears his name.
Yep. So, Bill, we salute you. We thank you for what you did for so many of us, and rest in peace, old friend and colleague. So, what's breaking, will be breaking, and we need to spend the rest of the show on it, is what's going on in the Mideast, and it's the basic Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And one of the main reasons Dr. Singer is with us is because actually there are two pieces. Alan, I know you published one and you're probably working on another one. Do you want to jump off with the one you first published a week ago just to set the stage, and then we can dig into what's going on?
I'm an American Jew, and 1967, I was a high school senior. And in June, my mother, her brother were both in Israel. And when the 6-day war broke out, my friends and I, we were Jewish from the Bronx, we actually signed up to go to Israel to provide support during the war. We never got to go because the war ended in 6 days. It was very important to us in our sense of identity especially growing up in the shadow of the Holocaust, where so many Jews had died during World War II. By 1973, however, I could no longer support the state of Israel and its occupation of the West Bank, its occupation of Gaza. It was one thing for Israel to defend itself, but since that 1967 war, Israeli policy has been to delay a settlement while it solidified control over what they called facts on the ground. So we now have a circumstance with millions of Palestinians have been displaced, where Palestinian lands have been absorbed, where Palestinian lands are occupied, and where Palestinians who are citizens of Israel have second-class rights. Since 1973, I could not support this. And the reason I'm starting this way is because a lot of people have said, if you oppose Israeli policy, that makes you anti-Semitic. What I wrote is opposition to oppression, opposition to occupation, opposition to apartheid does not make me anti-Jewish, does not make me anti-Semitic. It makes me against the policy of the state of Israel.
Alan, I'm glad you said that because Ray, you remember our old colleague, Danny Schechter, who worked with us in 2020. Bob, I don't know, were you on that show with us, but we had Danny Schechter on Media Watch. It must have been at least 7 or more years ago. And it was after one of those Middle Eastern flare-ups right after the Intifada, or I forget which one, because there have been so many from 2006, 2014, we lose track of them. But Danny came on and basically he was saying pretty much what you, Danny's nickname was Danny Schechter, the news dissector. and we always loved that because he would dissect the stuff as accurately and as objectively as possible without getting into ideology. And basically, he was calling out the Israeli government for their actions and their approach to the Palestinian conflict, the no two-state solution, the delay, just as you are. I wanted to get that in because I want folk to understand you're not the only Jewish person who actually have seen this. And Danny was telling us, like you probably have seen yourself, there are people in Israel, Jews, who call out the government when it wasn't Netanyahu for the fact that they were not dealing in good faith. Go ahead, Alan.
Well, no, that's a very good point because Israel has not dealt in good faith since its own war for independence in 1948. And so we have documents written by David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, where he essentially calls for driving out Palestinians so there could be a contiguous Jewish state, a Jewish state where they would not belong. And under what the Palestinians called the Nakba, people were expelled from their villages. There was a piece in the Times about a village called Lydia. What was interesting is Lydia is the was the Palestinian name for the town. It's now known as Lod because what they've done is they've tried to erase that this was a Palestinian town.
Right.
So we're looking at really now 75 years of denying people the right to who they are.
Called imperialism.
Yeah.
So when people say you're anti-Semitic, tell them you're not. Tell them you're anti-imperialism.
I don't think they always see that distinction, but yes, I think we have to constantly repeat that. Because
and we as a country, and I'm not going to speak about other countries' involvement, but we facilitate this. Yeah. Israel gets a lot. I don't know what the percentage is, but I know that it's high up there. Percentage of military arms and other equipment from the U.S.
Between $3.5 and $4 billion a year. Okay,
that's amazing to me, and they provide nothing to Hamas or any of the Palestinian groups.
Yeah, you talked about the Iron Dome. The Iron Dome. Okay. The Iron Dome was built with U.S. dollars, a lot of U.S. research, and that Iron Dome is why Hamas can fire
Yeah,
3,000
and
rockets,
they never hit. Yeah,
and maybe a handful of Israeli civilians might get hurt, injured, or killed. And Israel will fly planes all over the West Bank and Gaza. And when they drop their bombs, civilians die like indiscriminately. And
And
so
those are American
have a thing about disproportionate force. Talk a little bit about, I mean, there are a number of issues that you've raised in your pieces. Go ahead and deal with that disproportionate use of force.
The planes that are dropping the bombs on Palestinian cities in Gaza are F-16s. They are American planes. The strategic missiles, the guided missiles, which are taking down buildings, which took down the building where the Associated Press and Al Jazeera had their offices, those are American strategic missiles. The United States cannot say, we're impartial, we think it's wrong. The United States is providing the weaponry, which does.
True, but also, what do you say? What do you say to people who say, "Well, Hamas regularly stores weapons in places like hospitals and places that they think will not be bombed for humanitarian reasons"?
Well, where should they store them? Should they just put up a sign?
I agree with you.
And say, "Kill us, we're standing here"?
I agree with you, but I've heard that recently. I had a friend of mine give me that argument just yesterday, as a matter of fact.
Well, if the United States gave them fighter planes and gave them the Iron Dome so they couldn't be bombed back, then they wouldn't have to do it. It's disparate support. And
I agree with you. Absolutely.
And there's not a person, none of us are going to argue that Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself. It's just the level of the response. I mean, just what you mentioned, the destruction of the AP Al Jazeera building blew me off of my couch when I saw that. That's just a way overboard response to what impact Hamas is having on Israel itself. But go ahead, Alan.
No, there was a very interesting piece on Trevor Noah on the Daily Show this week that really captured things for me. What Trevor Noah said was, I'm not saying who started it. He was, I mean, he's funny. He said, everybody says you go back. This one started, that one started. He said this conflict probably started in caveman days when Arabs and Israelis were probably hitting each other with sticks. But he said, when they were hitting each other with sticks, they both had sticks. And that what we have to look at is a disparate response. So what we have are hundreds dead on one side and a handful on another. We have tons of bombardment, aerial bombs, and virtually very few on the other. He said the people with greater power have greater responsibility to control their use of power. One of the problems in the media is it tries to be balanced. It doesn't want to take a side, doesn't want to offend anybody. But sometimes you have to offend. You have to say this is disproportionate. This is not legitimate.
It's not about offending. It's about reporting accurately. And that is why I get really upset with the way the American press is reporting this conflict. I get sick and tired about Hamas has rained down 3,000 rockets. Yeah, okay, that sounds like a lot of rockets. Guess what? They can't get through. And so I hear 12 Israeli civilians died as a result of the 3,000 rockets, including a child. And the stories come out that way. And then as an afterthought, by the way, 92 Palestinian civilians died, 11 children included. I mean, you talk about disproportionate response. We're talking about disproportionate casualties. But we whipped that horse. Let's get to the political side of this, because I really want to get into the historical side of why we're sitting here having this discussion about you're not an anti-Semite because you're not supporting Israel, because you're denouncing Israel for what it's doing. We have seen American presidents try to negotiate stuff in good faith with people in the Mideast. And only in the early stages were the Israelis actually trying to have a negotiated peace settlement. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Alan, but my reading of this, back in the days when I was on the foreign assignment desk for ABC News and covered this stuff and assigned people to cover this stuff, they played fair only early on. When it became politically expedient for Israeli prime ministers to not fight for that peace, they went into a, what do they call it? Delay mode. In basketball was the four corners, offense, whatever. It was all about giving the Israelis more time to put more settlers into those occupied lands so they could displace more Palestinians. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I can't correct you because you're right, Eric. Starting with Camp David Accords, this is in the Carter administration. The Israelis, they wanted a deal with Egypt and Jordan to take some pressure off them, but they used once they had the deals with Egypt and Jordan, which the United States not only brokered but paid for, they essentially stopped offering anything.
Alan, I think you froze. So basically, hopefully you will unfreeze. Go ahead. You just froze a little bit. They stopped offering what?
There was a cynicism with the Oslo Accord in 1993, and that was during the Clinton administration. And the cynicism was, in order for Israel to appear to be negotiating, it needed a negotiating partner. So what Israel did is it resurrected Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had largely been discredited in large parts of Palestine, where the Hezbollah and Hamas had become the dominant groups. Mm-hmm. So they negotiated with a puppet. And then they announced we have a peace process, which Israel never respected and which the PLO never had the ability to enforce. Meanwhile, they kept on increasing settlements, first in Jerusalem and then on the West Bank. And the settlements are not only taking land, they're grabbing up water. It is now at the point that the illegal Israeli settlements are allowed to remain on the West Bank. It would be virtually impossible to create a Palestinian state there because it's just broken up into many pieces.
We got an apartheid regime in place.
Yes.
Same kind of crazy checkerboard crap that the South Africans did in South Africa to the Africans when they were trying to put their apartheid regime on the majority Black people. That's what the Israelis have done to the Palestinians.
Yes.
Correct me if I'm right, Alan. If I'm wrong, Alan, I might have the wrong person in mind, but was it Shamir who said in his retirement when somebody asked him that his entire point was delay, delay, delay?
I think it was Sharon, but it could have been.
No, you're right. No, yes,
Sharon.
that's who it was.
Exactly who it was.
Yes, I had the
you had the
name
S.
wrong.
You had the S. The S was
the S.
the SH.
And he called it facts on the ground. What he said was, let him talk while we establish facts on the ground by settling up the settlements and taking the water resources. And then what are they going to do about it? I actually, from my perspective, I think Israel has to go back to its 67 boundary. I think Jerusalem will have to become an international city. And I think we have to say to Israeli settlers in Palestine, you could stay there, but then you're going to become Palestinian. And we could say to Palestinians who have claims in Israel, we will offer you a financial settlement. The United States, the EU, will offer you a financial settlement. And then if you don't want it, you could pursue your claims in Israeli courts. But again, it would be offering people a settlement that would allow them to go on and have lives.
Here's my question about settlements and land and repatriation and financial settlement. One of the, besides the mosque attack, last week, there was an eviction of Palestinian settlers in East Jerusalem. And I believe you sent me a clip, Alan, and I'd seen it prior, where the Palestinian woman is standing in tears, screaming at some Israeli settler, telling him, "You are stealing my land, my home. Why are you doing this to me?" And he stands there and says to her, "If I don't steal it, someone else will, so you might as well move on." That is the blatant way that they are taking Palestinian lands. Right now, they're doing it in East Jerusalem, but they've been doing it since 1948. And from Ray's stuff that Ray sent us, this has been going on since 1920.
What
Palestine
happened?
was Palestine. And somebody said, well, the Jews need a homeland, so let's let them immigrate to Palestine.
In the late 19th century, during nationalist movements all across Europe, and what you have are Eastern European Jews don't have a homeland, and they're being really driven out by other nationalist movements out of the places where they had lived for centuries. And that's the movie Fiddler on the Roof, where they're just driven out. Many come to the United States, but there are those who dreamed of having a Jewish state, and they looked towards the biblical homeland, where they had not been for 2,000 years in significant numbers. During World War I, Great Britain promised Palestine. Palestine at the time was a Ottoman Turkish province. The Ottoman Turkish Empire was in a state of collapse. Britain takes it over, promises it to the local Palestinians, but also promises it to British Jews. After the war, both sides won what they were promised, and Britain, as it does in all its colonies, divides and conquers, plays them off against each other. So the Jewish nationalism, which we call Zionism, coming out of Europe, and the Palestinian nationalism are in conflict because Britain pits them against each other. Britain is finally driven out in 1948, decides it's not worth it to keep it as a colony anymore, largely because of Jewish terrorists.
Right. And you should say that, because one of those Jewish terrorists later became a great Israeli statesman, the guy by the name of Menachem Begin.
Yes.
And trust me, I met the man in person in Canada on one of my journalism trips. Very personable, very charming man. And when I started reading his history, I says, oh, hell, this guy, the great statesman, was basically terrorist at any price, at any cost. And that's what he did. He was a terrorist.
I believe he was scheduled to be executed, and then it just didn't happen. But many of the people in his gang, I believe it's called the Irgun, were executed by the British as terrorists because of attacks on civilian targets, including a large hotel in Jerusalem.
So Alan, I want you to sort of interpret this whole bit, because we don't have any ability to communicate with Hamas, because as a country, we're calling Hamas a terrorist organization.
Yeah.
Hamas is a terrorist organization because they're doing exactly what Menachem Begin did when he was trying to drive the British out and get his homeland, correct? And so why are we trying to normalize what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians by calling Hamas a terrorist group, when that's what the same method the Jews used to establish their homeland? Why do we not just admit that these people are trying to fight for displacement, get their rights back, get equal footing, get equal standing, and stop calling terrorists and start negotiating with them?
We don't want to become an enemy of Israel. We don't want to fight Israel. They would, if we became anti-Israel, what do you think would happen? Alan, what do you think would happen?
I didn't say become anti-Israel. I say become pro-Hamas, just like you're pro-Israel.
Well, if you're pro-Hamas, what are you?
Trust me, if you can do it duplicitously behind the scenes like the Brits did and cause the problem, you can do it up front in front of everybody and say, hey, I like you because you're trying to get what you deserve. I like you because you're trying to defend what you have earned, and you all need to come together. And I'm not going to call you a bad guy and call you a good guy when you're the good guy doing some seriously bad things to the guys you're calling the bad guys. Am I losing my mind, or is that not logic?
Just pull me up when you see that headline.
Well, Bernie Sanders had a very interesting piece up in the New York Times. And Bernie Sanders said, yes, we have to support the right of Israel to exist, but what about the rights of the Palestinians? And I think that that needs to be the US position. The United States has to say to Israel, we support your right to exist, and we have always, but we cannot support your occupation of Palestinian territory, cannot support your blockade on Gaza, we cannot support your attack on these people.
Absolutely, as Eric says, you know, that's exactly the way it needs to be. Yeah. But this is not a revelation. This is wise people have known this for 100 years.
And we have about a minute and a half left.
Well, here's what I'm going to say.
Let me answer, Ray, because what's interesting, in the 1950s, when Israel seized and Britain and France seized the Suez Canal, Eisenhower ordered them off. And because the United States was not playing sides in the 1950s under Eisenhower.
Okay, so
what has happened is in the United States is a very strong pro-Israel lobby. Yes, they include American Jews. American Jews are very divided over what Israel is doing, but it also includes evangelical Christians who believe that the Jewish state somehow signals the second coming. And there's also strong financial support for Israel.
And we have about 45 seconds left.
Here's the deal.
Politicians don't want to lose the money. They don't want to lose the Jewish support, and they don't want to lose the evangelical Christian support. So politicians play politics. Yeah. And they don't take stands that need to be taken.
Here's what needs to happen, at least globally, public relations wise. The Palestinians have a right to survive. They have a right to exist, and their lives are just as precious as anybody else's life. It's time for PLM to get as wide a global response as BLM. And with that, I think we're about out of time, right?
Yes, we are.
This has been Media Watch. I'm your co-host, Eric Tait.
I'm Bob Anthony. Follow us on YouTube and Twitter at Media Watch EVT.
And I'm Raymond Peterson.
And I'm the friend and guest, Alan Singer.
Thanks for joining us, Alan. Folks, stay safe. Be aware it's still COVID out there. Catch you the next time.